Welcome to So-and-So, brought to you by BERNINA, Made to Create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Our guest today is Pam Mahshie, the overlock machine business manager at BERNINA. An accomplished sewist in her own right, Pam started sewing seriously in 5th grade, learning from her mom, who would sew dresses for all occasions for both her sister and her. Pam eventually fell in love with the serger while in the MATC program in Madison, Wisconsin, and shortly after graduation started working for a major sewing machine company, traveling and showing sergers for home use. She has filmed shows for PBS and hosted online learning with Nancy Zeman, Martha Pullen of Martha's Sewing Room, as well as Fonz and Porter from Love of Quilting. Last March, Pam joined BERNINA as the overlock business manager to help launch the new L8 machines. Pam has 2 sons and 2 beautiful grandsons. Active in her church, Pam feels that serving others is what fills her with the greatest joy. She looks at sewing as a gift and loves to share it with others as much as she can. Hi, Pam, and welcome to So-and-So.
Thanks, Meg, and thanks for having me. It's just a great opportunity to be able to spend some time and tell others about how much I love sewing and how they too can enjoy more sewing through serging and decorative applications.
Absolutely, Pam. You've got some wonderful things to share, and I want to start out with this. Your mom taught you to sew, so tell us more about this learning journey.
So yes, my mom actually taught me to sew, and it was a great opportunity because she would take us to her sewing classes where she learned to sew from someone who actually was the manager of a French design workshop in France. So it was very exciting to be able to go and spend time with Mrs. Ernie and my mom and just see how sewing has really now, thinking back, how sewing has evolved and the different ways that sewing had actually developed and taken place over the years, for sure.
What's the first thing you remember sewing?
Well, I can tell you very clearly the first thing I remember sewing was a long-waisted dress for myself. And my mom was very particular about the ways that she would sew and sewing things that she would do. So her part was to always put zippers in by hand. Well, a long-waisted dress has a 22-inch zipper. and I remember having to put in that 22-inch zipper by hand more than one time. And that really kind of, it could have pushed me in one direction or the other, but I think it really showed me that to do things right, you have to persevere and you have to make sure that you're concentrating when if you're wanting to do it the right way, for sure.
I'm glad it pushed you in the direction that it did. Do you still have that piece?
I have pieces of it. I don't have that particular dress any longer, but I do have a quilt that I had made in 1976. I remember that because Artex paints were so popular back then. And and this quilt will never die and it will not fall apart because it was made mostly of double knit polyester. And it's like, oh boy. So when you look at that, and a real quilter would probably curl up and when they would look at it, but there I incorporated a lot of the different fabrics where I had made, and my mom and I had worked very closely together on making different garments. So you can go back and look at different parts and say, I remember that dress, or I remember those culottes that we made, or, different parts that you would have incorporated into different either home deck or garments.
You know what? One of the beautiful things that I've heard many times on this podcast is how the pieces that people have created evoke such good memories and the stories behind them.
Yeah. And, just recently, my mom passed away. So when I look at things and talk about everything that she has taught me, that it makes it even more dear to me, knowing that what she taught me, I can continue to teach others and develop skills that they might have as well.
So you carry her legacy on through your love of sewing and sharing that.
Right, exactly.
Pam, you have talked about the MATC program in Madison, Wisconsin, and that it really helped you become a sewist. Will you tell us a little bit more about the program and how it helped you grow?
Sure. When I was in high school, one thing I always wanted to be was a medical pathologist. And when I started looking into different activities and programs, I'm like, oh, well, maybe that's way too much schooling. So then I looked at the next area that I really enjoyed, and that was sewing. So MATC stands for Madison Area Technical College. And when I graduated from high school, they had a very intense program, which was revolving around not only sewing or the knowledge of sewing, but it actually developed and would develop someone in a sewing business. So we learned how to demonstrate machines. We learned how to textiles, different textiles. We learned how to draft patterns, how to display in a store or develop ads and things. So it was a very well rounded program. And I actually still keep in touch with one of my professors that I had worked with. And she was very integral in helping position at least 5 or 6 uh, pe- ladies and gentlemen from that program into the sewing industry, and then help develop companies and in their education departments or sales departments from that program. So we definitely learned more than just how to sew. But I can certainly remember that when I first went into that classroom, they had this machine, this funny little machine sitting on the table. And that was my first exposure to a serger. And that was in 1982.
And that exposure turned into a love of sergers, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth later in the show. One thing I do want to ask you: you have said that you feel sewing can be a way to get away from whatever's going on around you in everyday life, and also that when we make something and give it, we're giving a part of ourselves. Certainly, in the days we're in now, people do need to escape. So would you share with us a little bit about what this escape is and giving of ourselves and how this has worked specifically for you?
Sure. Some might feel that even just when you say the word sewing, some will think about that sewing was always more of a way of utilitarian, or it was more of a mending opportunity that had to take place. And so many times when I'm out traveling on an airplane, or you're talking with someone and they ask, oh, what do you do? And you say, well, I work with sewing machines. And people typically say, well, do they still do that?
Oh my.
Yeah. And it's certainly those people that are totally unaware of how popular quilting and sewing really, really has become. So when we look at our busy days, and I think about many times when I worked with Nancy Zeman, she would say, you can't wrap a baby in an iPad. And what that means is that you need that comfort, you need those textiles that you can wrap yourselves around. And technology, as good as it is and as viable as a entity that we need right now in society, we still need that tactile comfort, escape, is, as you said, in a way where you're sitting at your machine and your mind just goes in different directions, whether it's to someone who taught you how to sew, or it's someone who has given you an inspiration or a picture that you've seen, or something you're even wanting to replicate. And place in your home or give to someone else. And I always say that when anybody makes anything, 90% of it is something we give away. So when we do that, we are always giving a part of ourselves to that person that we're giving that project that we've made to. And what it does is it just helps you when you are in your sewing room. I find myself just thinking away from all of the distractions that you might have. And a lot of times I call my sewing room my happy place because it does make me happy looking at the fabrics and, just holding on to those textiles too.
Can you recall any specific story of something that you made and gave to somebody and the meaning that had for you?
Specifically, okay, yes, I do, because you mentioned that I'm very involved with our church, and one thing that I really like to do is to make christening gowns or to make baptismal gowns. So what I'll do is I did make one, and there was a family in our church who they wanted to do something very special, and they just weren't able to do that. And so I gave them one of the gowns that I had made, and they just fell in love with that. Or taking a wedding gown from one of my mom's friends. She wanted to make a christening gown for her granddaughter. And as I was taking apart the dress, and she was married in like 1974. And when I took the dress apart, a piece of rice from their wedding fell out of the dress.
Oh my.
So I was at the dentist, I remember, with my son, and I'm like, wait, hold on. I need a tooth box, and they're like, wait, what happened? Did somebody's tooth fall out? Come on back. I said, no, I just found this. So then what I did is I not only made the dress for her granddaughter, but then I made a pillow, and I took that piece of rice from their dress, from that had fallen out of the dress, and I made her a pillow so that it had the colors of their wedding that they would have originally had in their wedding, that piece of rice, their date, their kids' names, and just, bringing that all together gave her something, because then a few months later, her husband passed away. So there's so many different stories that you can, when you really sit down and think about what you're doing and how you're using that talent that you have, you can use it in so many different ways to truly bless other people.
It seems like the directions you go sometimes with your sewing projects can take a turn that you don't even see coming and become even more meaningful to you.
Yes, absolutely.
Pam, you work with BERNINA as the business manager for overlocks. And to a lot of sewists, sergers or overlocks can look scary, intimidating, but they can be really creative and have so many options. Would you tell us about some of these options and how you've used some of them?
Sure. So you're absolutely right that every time I talk with someone about a serger or an overlock, their eyes get kind of wide, and you can see that fear of, oh yeah, no, I'm never even going to look at one of those because they have too many threads and I don't know what I'm going to do. And, isn't that just a machine that finishes your seams? Well, years ago, that's exactly what they were. But now, with the use of decorative threads and different textiles that you can combine together, you can do some very creative, what I call off the edge type of stitching. And with the machines, they always think, or people tend to think, that you can only sew on the edge of your fabric. But now, of course, with the introduction of the L8 machines and others, you can certainly sew in the middle of your fabric, and you're not limited to the edge of stitching. And then, of course, when you incorporate decorative threads, that just kind of takes you to another level of creativity, and then applying those stitches definitely gives you a totally different look than what you would have in a basic overlock stitch.
Do you have some examples of some things that you've created using these machines?
Oh, sure. I mean, we've done some home decorating projects, specifically referring back to the love that I have of heirloom sewing. You can insert laces, you can create time saving. Nobody has a whole lot of time either. And in heirloom sewing, many times people think first that's difficult too. And then when you throw a serger in with that, they're like, oh, yeah, no, there's no way I'm going to ever do that. But you can save so much time because it's sewing it, it's stitching it, and it's overcasting the seams all at the same time that you'd have to do 3 and 4 steps with. Specifically, we've done, making of piping is another opportunity that with your sergers, you do it so very quickly and your projects are completed in a much faster period of time. And, working with quilting and the Love of Quilting program with Fons and Porter, when I first introduced this project to them, they were like, well, quilters don't use a serger. And I'm like, okay, but let's take a look at this project. And you can tell me no. And, they're sitting at the table as we're presenting and kind of leaning back in their chair like, okay, prove it to me. So then as I'm showing the different opportunities and ways that you can use a machine, they started leaning in closer to the table. And in the end, they were touching the quilt and I'm like, okay, I think I got them now. But it really does show versatility. And no matter what kind of area that you're interested in, whether you're garment sewing or quilting, open our minds up because there are so many machines and ways that you can actually create a project without, taking a lot of extra time. Or there's always new things. I think about years ago when when we went from hand sewing to machine sewing. Sometimes that thought process was probably the same, where those ladies or gentlemen who were always sewing by hand, with an introduction of a machine, they're like, how is that going to work? And is it going to look as good as what I've always done? So there's always a way of learning and new opportunities that we have to keep our minds open to.
Pam, you mentioned doing some work with Fons and Porter from Love of Quilting. You've also done some shows for PBS. You've worked online with Nancy Zeman and Martha Pullen of Martha's Sewing Room. Great story about Fons and Porter. Can you tell us about some more of these experiences?
So it was quite an honor to be even asked to participate in many of these programs. And, when you're when you're a girl from Wisconsin, and Nancy Zeman is the icon really, in not only because she's from Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, but she's an icon in the sewing industry. And when you're asked to be part of a program that she's actually done, it was like, really? She wants me to show her how to do something?
Sure.
And even Martha Pullen also. But it gave us a different look, a different way of presenting. And I think kind of the forerunner of everything all the online learning that we're doing right now was really founded on many of these shows that were done on PBS or starting online earlier on. But it did give customers a closer look or a way of seeing other types of sewing opportunities that they don't always get to see because they might be away from a dealer and they're not able to come into classes. So this really did give them a great opportunity to see new ways of using different products and experimenting with different types of sewing techniques. And with the the opportunities of working with these ladies on their shows, it was just a great honor to be able to share that.
It seems that during COVID times, the community of sewists and quilters has grown exponentially because, to your point, you've been able to reach people who aren't in proximity to dealers or even knowing how to get into classes.
Correct. Or now not wanting to come close enough together to be able to be in the same classroom with others as well. And I always say, too, is that you don't have to take your machine away and go to a classroom. You're learning, and you can either touch pause and do the technique right there at the time, and you have opportunity to rewind it if you don't catch it the first time.
Sure, definite advantage. Absolutely. Pam, you talk about enjoying doing heirloom projects. Is there any special way that you source the pieces or the fabrics that you use for these?
There are several different places that you can access. I know Farmhouse Fabrics is a great resource for heirloom laces and fabrics. And sometimes we think about heirloom as always the lacy and the frilly from maybe the 1980s. But it isn't always that way. And sometimes when we talk about heirloom, we don't have to always think about it in that way. And you're probably creating an heirloom that you could pass down to someone else also. So don't always think necessarily of heirloom as lacy and frilly, which that's the term that's always used. But you can also use that term for anything that you're making and then making a legacy out of that.
Now, you've often said that creating and thinking out of the box, or as you put it, off the edge, has always been your focus. Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, one example that is like totally off the edge, and I honestly don't remember how it came about, but I think it was that I developed it in the month of April because of Earth Day and thinking more about recycling and using recycling objects. So I had made a raincoat out of different types of shopping bags. So one of the shopping bags that was so very colorful was from a little girl's store. Mm-hmm. So in our neighborhood, I went to a couple of houses where I knew they would shop at this one particular store, and I would ask them, do you have one of these bags? And they're like, well, sure. So then it kind of got out in the neighborhood that I was looking for these bags. So I had little girls coming up to my door with their shopping bags, or probably saying to their parents, Miss Pam needs us to go shopping so she can get the bags. So I took these bags and I cut them all apart and fused some interfacing on the back side of a plastic bag. And then I made different blocks and made a raincoat, and they look like quilt blocks. So then the sashing between all of these blocks, I wanted black because there was so much color that was in there. So I went out to my garage and I got a black garbage bag and I fused the interfacing on the back of that and then cut it apart and used that as my sashing on the raincoat. Uh-huh. And actually I've used it several times and it works pretty well, and lined it with a cotton fabric. So that's probably my most unusual, off the edge, out of the box project that I'd ever done.
Do you still have that raincoat?
I do.
Well, we're going to ask you to make sure we get a picture of that for the So-and-So podcast website, because this is fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would love to see what that looks like.
Yeah, I'll definitely take a picture of it and send that off to you, because it's quite cute looking. It's comfortable wearing, and it's, just a way to help preserve the earth a little bit using those recycled bags.
And a community project, and I'm sure the parents in your neighborhood love that you were, and I'm air quoting here, sending their children shopping so you can get shopping bags.
Exactly.
Pam, you've commented that traveling can get old for some. That is, in the days when we traveled, but you love to be with those who would come to events and classes to see the smiles and light bulb moments. Can you tell us about a few of those light bulb moments?
So we talked about how intimidated people can be when they're working with sergers or any type of new sewing equipment or equipment of any kind. And I definitely remember this was early on when I was first starting to travel. And someone called and they said, "Could I come in and have you show me how to put ribbing on the neckline of a t-shirt?" And I'm like, "Well, sure, come on in." And remember, back then in the early 80s, machines, these sergers were so very new, and nobody really knew what to do with them very much. So I said, "Sure, bring it in, come on in and set it up." So she came in, set it all up. I was working with someone and I said to her, "Now show me what you're doing." Because sometimes it's easier to see what someone is doing and then be able to show. So she sets her machine up and she takes the pedal, the foot, quote unquote, pedal, and sets it on the table next to her. And she's trying to stretch the ribbing with one hand and attach it to the neckline and press on the foot pedal, quote unquote, on the table with her other hand. And I'm like, so you don't want to just burst out laughing and say, "Well, what's the matter? How come you think goes here?" Well, remember, these are all brand new machines. So I said to her, "I've got a much easier way of doing that." So I take the pedal, set it on the floor, and step on the pedal, use both hands. And she goes, "Wow, that is so much easier."
Hence a light bulb moment.
Hence a light bulb moment. So I said to her, "Why would you think that is where it should go?" She goes, "Well, that's the way they showed it to me."
Oh my.
And I said to then the dealer that was there, I said, "Why did you do that?" And he goes, "Well, my cord doesn't reach the floor. So I have to put it on the table," which was then a light bulb moment for me to always remember to explain something, maybe even in a little more detail, because people don't always know, especially when it's a product that is so new and possibly very foreign to them. So that was a light bulb moment on both sides for us. But when someone walks into a classroom and they are working with a machine that they've never worked on before, and they make a project, and the smiles and the sense of accomplishment that they have actually made is just absolutely priceless to me. And they see that they can do it. That fear has just been taken away from them.
Pam, you've accomplished so much. What's next for you, and what's your dream as it relates to sewing?
Well, one thing that I would really like to do, and now having just recently come on board with BERNINA, I know there are trips over to Switzerland that are planned possibly when COVID finishes. So that's one of my dreams, is to be able to go and see the factories and meet with the engineers, which we've been meeting with the engineers via Zoom, but meeting someone, of course, face to face is always very nice, and it certainly makes that connection even stronger. But as far as looking down the road and different ways, I mean, I would just really like to see more people embrace sewing as not only, or to be able to see that sewing is not only a hobby, it can definitely be a way of life. It has certainly, I always say, I've never really worked a day in my life. Of course, there are days that I'm like, "Oh, what am I doing?" But we all have those. But it really has given me an opportunity to use what I just love to do and be able to share what I love to do and make a great living with it and help develop new products that are going to help those in the future accomplish the goals that they have set for their creativity and their sewing.
We've talked about a lot, many, many things today. Is there a question I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
Not that I can think of right off the top of my head. We've covered a lot. I always think about it too, and it's like whoever wants to hear what I have to say or what I want to do or what I've been doing, because it's just something that I really am passionate about. And when you do something that you love to do, as I've told my sons and myself too, that I've never worked a day in my life. So find something that you really do love to do, and it really it just comes from within you, right? And you're able to, and people are able to see that as well.
Absolutely. Pam, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. If any of our listeners would like to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do so?
Probably the best way is on Instagram. I'm not a big social media poster, but I certainly do respond to any correspondence that takes place on that in any of the social media platforms. I do also have through Facebook. I do have a Facebook page, I guess you call that, but also through Instagram or Facebook would probably be the best way.
Okay, perfect. Pam, thank you again for joining us on So and So.
Great. Thanks, Meg. And it was great to be here.
Well, there you have it. Another story about someone just like you, someone for whom sewing is so much more than a hobby. It's a way of life. It's a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to megoodman@theflintrock.com and put "You should hear their story" in the subject line. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank BERNINA for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.